Hello, this is Francisco Cribari, and in this video I want to briefly list a few things that I don't like about Linux. I've been running Linux since late 1996, and I like Linux a lot. Actually, I only run Linux. I don't have Windows on any of my machines, but there are a few things that I don't like about Linux. And not that we can blame Linux for that, but let me briefly list them. The first thing that most people think when we talk about things that we don't like about Linux are games. I'm not gonna mention games because I don't play games on computers, so that's not relevant to me. The first thing that I don't like about Linux is this. I am into photography, and I would like to be able to use some software developed by Adobe. For instance, Adobe Lightroom is probably the software that most photographers use, and also Adobe Photoshop. But Adobe does not make such software available for Linux. Obviously, we cannot blame Linux for that. I don't actually need to run Lightroom because I use a free software called Darktable, which I think is superior to Lightroom. It's actually more complex, it's harder to use, but I think it's actually, at least in my opinion, superior to Lightroom. It supports drone masks, parametric masks, and so on, that Lightroom does not support. And I also use GIMP, which is a free software alternative to Photoshop, but I basically use Darktable, and Darktable is outstanding. It's an excellent software. So I don't actually miss running Lightroom, but I would like to be able to run Lightroom if I wanted. And Darktable, I think it's at least as good as Lightroom, but probably GIMP is not on par with Photoshop. So people who need to use Photoshop, they don't find that GIMP is an alternative, at least for more advanced things. For instance, if you need to use Liquify is much better than in Photoshop than the implementation that's available in GIMP, and so on. So that's the first thing, the lack of some Adobe software for Linux. The second thing are BIOS updates. In some computers, you can perform BIOS updates from a flash drive, and that's what I do. I place on this computer as well. This is a Dell XPS 13 model 9343. Let's look at the Archwik page. And this is the Archwik page for this notebook. You see here that there is an entry for BIOS updates, and that's what I usually do. I place the BIOS update file on a flash drive. I boot, press F12, and perform BIOS update from there. But I cannot do that on all computers. For instance, I also have a Samsung notebook that requires that BIOS updates be performed via Windows, and that's something that I don't like. I would like to be able to perform BIOS updates without having to resort to Windows, and maybe in the future we'll be able to do that from Linux, and that would be outstanding. I believe there are some efforts into that direction, but I would like to see more progress on that in the future. And another thing that I don't like about Linux are SSD firmware updates. And if you go to the wiki page, the ArchWiki page on SSD, you will notice that it's possible in some cases to perform SSD firmware updates from Linux, but not in all cases. I recently needed to update the firmware for the SSD in my Samsung notebook, and I was not able to do that through Linux. So that's something that can be a pain in the neck sometimes, and it would be nice if we could just perform at least I would say that it would be nice if we could easily perform SSD firmware updates from Linux. So I'm not gonna list other things. I'm quite happy with Linux. I'm only gonna mention those three things: the lack of some Adobe software for Linux, the fact that sometimes we need to resort to Windows to perform BIOS updates, and also the fact that for several machines we need to perform SSD firmware updates through Windows or through some software developed for Windows. And what don't you like about Linux? Please comment and list the things that you dislike or the things that you think Linux could be better at.